Hello and welcome to another episode of The Living Philosophy. Today's episode, I want to talk about boomers. Most specifically about the term boomer. So the generation of boomers have gotten a little bit of slack. It's become a kind of an insulting, kind of a pejorative term among the millennials and zoomers, kind of pointing at the boomers as if they're some kind of morally lax and as if they're the problem. And it's really interesting when you look at the history really behind it, because I came across a book by Ken Wilber called Boomeritis, and in that he's talking about the mean green meme from Spiral Dynamics and how the boomers seem to be more consumed by that than any previous generation. And what he's talking about here is more or less the social justice aspect, except he's talking about it 20 years ago, back when it was more a term applied to boomers, because the boomer were the generation where the hippie movement came out, where the anti-war demonstrations came out. And this was the generation that started the revolution, the kind of pushback and the counterculture kind of came out of boomers. And the real social justice with, like, back in the days with like Martin Luther King, and you're looking at that rise of the brotherhood and the solidarity and kind of the innocent archetype emerging with the boomer generation.
You know, America is so obsessed with bad breath and with underarm deodorant. These are the biggest problems in the world. If you watch television at prime times, advertising is not concerned about poverty, not concerned about race oppression, not concerned about the police, but the biggest problem is your hair groomed, and what's it like under your arms, and do you have bad breath? And this is the American obsession. And so I think that a generation of kids which says we don't care about your concepts of cleanliness is a revolutionary generation.
And it's just interesting to fast forward, 50, 60 years, and just to see how that's turned around, and now that boomers are looked on as the problem, as the establishment, as the ones who are destroying the world. Even though boomers, compared to any previous generation, were much more socially conscientious and just generally ecologically and green-minded. And it's interesting, it makes me think that, we think of millennials and zoomers, the Generation Z, as snowflakes now, or as people who are excessively kind of empathetic and all those social justice kind of virtues. But what percentage of this generation is like that? And I wonder if we fast forward into 30 or 40 years, will we see the future generation calling, "Oh, Zoomer, oh, you old Zoomer, oh, you old millennial, how you are so, you were destroying the world so much, how you were so caught in your comfort and your luxury." And I wonder if it will pass on and whether it will change. Reminds me of an old great saying that any person under 30 who is not a liberal has no heart, and any person over 30 who's not a conservative has no brain. And as with all such things, there's an edge of truth in that, and as we grow older, we grow more conservative and we become part of the status quo because we have more responsibilities and we become more grounded and entrenched in the society. You become more aware of the complexities of life, and so that leans you more towards conservatism, I guess, and to upholding the status quo in some level. And I guess it's just the role of the youth who see things kind of coming out of childhood and into adolescence and early 20s. You see the world much more black and white and simpler, and the older you get, the more you see the complexity and the more bogged down in the minutiae you get. Whereas for the teenage revolutionary, you just see the way things should be, and you see the injustices in the world, and you see the inertia of the older generations, and you push back against that. And so inevitably, I guess the millennials and the zoomers will just become the next boomers, as we now call them pejoratively, as the next generation who become lax and who let the moral standards go in order to have more comfort. And the next generation shall say to us, as we say to the boomers, "Those who sacrifice a little liberty to gain a little security deserve neither and lose both." And so I guess this is just the cycle of the generations, is as time goes on, you grow more conservative and you let go of some of those values that you held in zeal when you were younger. So I think it'll just be curious, but there definitely does seem to be a growth. Like if you look at the boomers compared to the previous generations, seem to be much more, obviously, that the counterculture revolution, that there was much more of a social justice conscience that emerged in that generation compared to any previous generation, to the point where it actually became a movement. And you see that, I can imagine, and I'd say surely our generation, definitely, if you go by the noise of things, there's definitely a lot more in the cultural space of the social conscience coming out of millennials and zoomers. So I wonder if, fast forward 20, 30 years, will it be any different? Will it be a slight change? You know, how many of the old hippies, like the real proper hippies of the 60s, how many of those stayed true to those values as they grew older? And how many of them just ended up joining the machine man, or something like that? And how many of them just stopped kind of being hippies? How many of them was it a phase for, and how many was it a way of life and that they stayed true to? And I guess those are just the questions we'll have to wait and see. But I guess it's just a caution in humility for us generations, for us younger generations of millennials and zoomers, that we can look at the older generations as if they've been lax, but in our place they did more than any previous generation, and they accomplished a lot of change, they accomplished a lot of good, and we might very well end up very like them. And with a younger generation that with an extreme social justice conscience that makes us blush and that makes us push back against it, and it seemed extreme to us, and yet right now we seem extreme to the previous generation. So it's curious to see how things will bear fruit in the nature of time. Alternatively, maybe it could go the other way. And I remember reading one philosopher talking about a 150-year or 200-year cycle of manners, that manners rise and fall over time, and that the last peak was in the Victorian era. So that's when manners would have been at a high level of refinement, and then by like the 60s and 70s that had kind of gone into the anarchy of free love, and manners and prudishness had kind of gone out the window. But maybe, I guess, with Me Too now, you could see that that manner scale is on the way back up. The prudishness and the definition of that morality is becoming more structured, and perhaps moving back more towards a Victorian era of manners. And I just wonder whether that will happen with our social justice, whether this is a trend that will ebb and flow, and maybe in 40 years we'll see that the next generation rebels against how socially conscientious our generations are, and maybe move the other way. But it'd be interesting to see, and I just think it's important not to look at the previous generation as if they failed, when they did more than most previous generations, and they paved the way. They're the ones that raised these generations. They're the ones that created a culture in which the greater growth of the millennials and the zoomer culture could emerge. So it's funny how we always rebel against what went before, but maybe it's more closely connected to us than we thought. So that's my thought for the day anyway. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise, I shall see you next time. Thank you for watching.